Welcome, Gunrunner.
It's fair to say that the Sharp X68000 holds an almost mythical status amongst Western retro gamers. This incredibly powerful 16-bit computer from Japan that put all the machines we were playing to shame. Forget about the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga, the Sharp 68000 was the true champion of the 16-bit computer generation. Because it was only ever released in the land of the rising sun, there isn't actually a great deal of information about it online. Well, unless you're able to read Japanese, that is. And that formed a big part in me making this video. Firstly, because whenever I've made a video on the X68000 before, check out the amazing facts video linked in the description if you want to know more about the computer's history and what it does, they've done extremely well. But the second part of this reasoning is a lot less positive for me, because this lack of info made researching this video extremely difficult. I couldn't find a list of genuine Sharp X68000 exclusives anywhere on the internet, and cross-referencing the games from the lists I did have to see if they actually qualified was very laborious indeed. And if the checking wasn't hard enough, finding out any information about the games themselves was even more difficult. All I could do is play them and analyse them as best I could, so hopefully I've done them all justice. One thing I do want to add before we get going is how I made my actual choices. Well, that part was actually pretty simple. I tried to pick games from as many different genres as possible, and I think I did that pretty well. Though there is a small bias towards shoot 'em ups, because that's a genre where the Sharp X68000 really excels. Now, I'm sure you're all desperate to discover what games I chose and what they're all about. So let's get on with the show, as I proudly present 10 amazing Sharp X68000 exclusives.
スキャナーやビデオを使えば表現力もぐーんと広がって遊びみたいに仕事ができちゃう。
使いこなして夢工房。
見てください、この質感。カチッとしてシャープでしょう。全部こいつが計算して自分で書いてくれるんですよね。これはもう数字の後ですよ。
デジタル遊びのアーティスト。子犬のように甘えたい。シュリルリルハウ。子猫のように抱きしめて。
いくつ抜きでもいいかもしんない。
夢のドーム箱開けてみて。
このパソコンならこんなに面白いゲームが楽しめる。ゲームセンターのスーパーゲームからこのマシンのオリジナルゲームまで夢があってますます面白い。
パーソナルワークステーション X68000
夢の続きを語ろうよ。
Sharp.
I have to start with this one because although, as I already mentioned, searching for genuine Sharp X68 exclusives was an absolute minefield, this is one game that I saw mentioned quite a lot. It's easy to see why as soon as you start playing, because Angel Dive is certainly very impressive on a visual level, but it's actually the audio element that brings this game to the fore. That's because it supports MIDI music, so you can connect your Sharp X68000 up to a MIDI enabled keyboard and listen to the soundtrack in all its glory. A lot of people compare this to the Thunder Force games, and I can see why. There are certainly some similarities here. You can upgrade your ship with a multitude of different weapons, with one button used to fire and the other changing the direction. This is very much needed because although this is essentially a horizontally scrolling shoot 'em up, there are levels that scroll vertically and enemies approach you from all directions too. The only minor moan I have about Angel Dive is the lack of levels. There are just 3 main stages plus a special end of game boss battle, and you would expect a lot more from a game made in 1996. Now, of all the games on this list, I was most excited to discover this one, Asteroid Queen. But whilst the name makes it sound like it's a clone of Atari's classic 1979 vector-based arcade game Asteroids, it's actually inspired by a later Atari arcade game that span off from it in Gravitar. People might also see similarities with games like Thrust, Oids, and particularly the highly underrated Sega Mega Drive shoot-em-up Subterranea, which came out some 5 years later. The core gameplay is remarkably similar to Gravitar, as you battle against inertia to guide your ship through the cavernous levels, destroying the enemy ships, gun turrets and various types of buildings. On later levels you will also encounter force fields too, but what makes Asteroid Queen really unique is the mouse-based controls. This requires moving a cursor around the screen using one button to thrust your ship in that direction and the other button to fire. This sounds quite complicated, but works really well. Your shields deplete when they're hit by enemy fire or when you crash into the landscape. Okay, so this is nothing special visually, although the music is very nice, but it's the gameplay that's the real winner here. I've mentioned my love for top-down racing games many times before on this channel, and so when I was looking for a driving game on the Sharp X68000, this one really stood out. In many ways this one reminded me of the classic Atari ST and Amiga game Supercars, as each track scrolls around a large area rather than being fixed to a single screen, like Super Sprint for example. You start the game by selecting from one of 3 cars that vary in terms of speed and handling, so you need to decide what is most important, and personally I went for extra handling, as the courses here are full of turns as well as a multitude of hazards, making them very tricky. There is sand, big puddles of water, crash barriers, barrels and rocks amongst other things that will block your path, but it's also possible to knock your opponents into these too. And speaking of those rival drivers, there are 3 of them, making 4 races in total, and you need to make the podium to progress. Thankfully the game is pretty average, certainly nothing to complain about, but what I will complain about is the intensely irritating audio that will have you reaching for the volume button. Despite this minor irk, racing fans should still take a look at Bad Road. There's a whole series of these Barry games for the Sharp X68000 as the name suggests, but this was the first one I came across, and despite being a pretty generic vertically scrolling shoot 'em up in many regards, it drew me in with one rather unique feature, and that is the requirement to play the game on a Tate oriented monitor, to give you a long vertical display, just like you'd see in the arcades for games like this. As soon as I started playing, it reminded me a lot of the MSX shoot 'em up Xray by those amazing shmup specialists Compile, as it features very similar graphical effects in the background and very similar enemy attack patterns too. The main difference is that this one has a wide range of power-ups to collect, but such is the enemy onslaught, it almost becomes a risk and reward mechanic. You can probably see from the video here that you have to keep moving constantly if you're going to stay alive. This is certainly a game for those who like a challenge. I briefly mentioned the graphics already, but there are some lovely backdrops with lots of small sprites zooming around everywhere. There's also a nice soundtrack playing throughout the game too. In many ways, Command Xray could actually be described as a horizontally scrolling version of the game we just looked at, because this is also a shooter up with fancy background effects, although even more so here, and it doesn't let up with the sheer amount of enemies it throws at you either. And in this game you have to try and survive the onslaught without the use of power-ups, making it even more difficult. I suppose this is an early example of what evolved into the bullet hell genre that became so popular in Japan especially. 68000's homeland of course. And let's touch on those visuals again, because I only mentioned them briefly at the start of this review. Because the 3D background effects are extremely impressive indeed, and then there are the pre-rendered bosses, which look absolutely spectacular too. I think the visuals are definitely the main draw of this game, and I have to confess that that was the main reason I really wanted to include it here, even though I am far from being a graphics whore. Oh yeah, and Command Xray also has fantastic music and sound effects too, so that's impressive all round really. If you like challenging shooters, then this will be right up your street. Okay, so I know most people look down on sports games these days, and many even see them as completely worthless. I think this has a lot to do with the more modern concept of yearly updates. It basically means they keep upgrading the same game over and over. Thanks EA. But back in the day we had a wide range of genuinely different ones, and everyone had their favourites. In fact, the genre was considered so important that the success of the Sega Genesis in North America was pretty much built on sports titles. In fact, there are a lot of sports sims from that period of gaming that I personally look back on very fondly, so I really wanted to include at least one here, and dynamic Formesian Soccer really leapt out at me, especially as it appears to be an incredibly blatant clone of Anko's hugely popular kick-off games. Everything is so similar from the menus to the top-down gameplay itself, and so those familiar with kick-off will feel right at home here. But I have to talk about that name for a moment. I mean, what the hell does Formesian mean? Google offered up nothing, and I can only assume it's a bad English translation, and the word they meant to use was formation, one that is very common in Japanese footy games. another good puzzle game, so I was very excited to discover Pita Pat, which is named as such because it stars two cute rabbit-like characters called Pit and Pat. These adorable bunnies have to team up to tackle a seemingly endless stream of branching levels that involves matching up coloured blocks, which is certainly a far from unusual puzzle game concept for the most part, but it's the way it's implemented here that is fairly unusual. There are two different game modes at play, a standard single player story and a two-player competitive mode. The goal of the game is to clear the designated amount of blocks on each level by matching 4 of the same block vertically, horizontally or diagonally. Once the level starts, the blocks fall down and then you have to move your character around the screen pushing the fire button to eliminate them. You are able to do this in any direction, including diagonals, and can also push unwanted blocks out of the way. Although you start on your own controlling Pit in single player, a computer controlled Pat will join you on later levels to help you out. Pita Pat has really cute graphics and sound, addictive gameplay and plenty of unique features that keep you coming back for more. Given the Sharp X68000 is well versed in the fighting game genre, no surprise when you learn that it was used as the development machine by Capcom for their CPS arcade games, I knew I would need to include one here. When looking down a list of games, I noticed that there were quite a substantial amount based on Sailor Moon, a hugely popular Japanese manga that still remains pretty unknown to Western audiences. However, nearly all of these were multi-format, also appearing on other popular Japanese consoles and computers of the time like the NEC PC-98, Nintendo Super Famicom, PC Engine and Fujitsu FM Towns. This rather long-winded title isn't though, which is why I'm including it here of course, but I was even more interested to learn of its origins, because according to the scant information I found online about it, it's not actually an official Sailor Moon game at all, and was put together by a group of very passionate fans. All I can say about that is that they did a really great job, as Senshi Super Moon Fighter X is a really well featured fighter that lets you select between 18 different characters, has a wide selection of special moves and several different gameplay modes too. Another game by Sprite Team, and another game that's based on a fairly unknown Japanese franchise, but in this case we have an even more obscure one in the form of Silk Road. Now, there are actually loads of games based on the anime series that never made it to the West, including the very similarly named Silk Road Legend arcade game, but this one only appeared on the 16-bit Sharp computer, and so fills my cute Japanese platformer slot in this video rather nicely. You control a purple-haired girl who apparently is half monkey, which is why she sports a tail, and she must make her way around each level collecting all the fruit. You do this by jumping across platforms, climbing vines, and puking on blocks to destroy them. Yes, really. There are enemies who get in your way, who can be stunned by either jumping on them or throwing your flute at them, and you have to be careful not to trap yourself. In fact, the puzzle element here is just as important as the platform one, and the later levels get very fiendish indeed. Both the graphics and sound are adorable here. There is plenty of challenge too, especially as you can always come back to beat your best level times. Can you guess what movie franchise this game was inspired by? That's right, Back to the Future! No, seriously, it's pretty blatant, isn't it? And a message on the title screen even says, "We love that movie so much." So the developers didn't even try to hide it. But Kayat weren't just inspired by the Star Wars movie, it seems they played the Atari arcade game too, as Star Wars 1991 is certainly pretty similar. We have the same cockpit view, the same 3D vector graphics, and very similar gameplay too. I was actually quite surprised to hear the music however, which seems remarkably similar to the tunes found in the awesome Sega arcade game Galaxy Force. So yeah, the gameplay will certainly feel very familiar to anyone who played the Atari arcade classic, but that's not to say they didn't tweak the formula a little here. One great addition is the battle zone like scanner at the bottom that shows you where the enemies are, and speaking of those enemies, there are absolutely loads of them. This is certainly a lot more action packed than the Atari game. There might be an official Star Wars game for the X68 in the form of Attack on the Death Star, but I actually think I'd rather play this as it's a lot more fun.
New Life Sharp.
今、黄金のマスクがよみがえる。パーソナルワークステーション X68000。高解像度の自然色。CPU68000 の広大なアドレス空間。さまざまな音をそっくりデジタル記録。黄金のグラフィックスを持ったシャープ X68000。
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing Sharp X68000 exclusives. Can you think of any other one-off titles that only ever came out for this legendary 16-bit computer, or do you think some of these games were unworthy of inclusion? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to following patrons and YouTube backers in particular for their much appreciated pledges. Paul Daniel, Mins, Dos Gamerman, Luke MC, Carl Olsen, Seth Robinson, Grady Haynes, Mark Strickland, Kalimatorn, Trogdor the Burninator, Daniel Skoronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, Alan J. Dodds, Your Eyes Are Bleeding, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to host extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.